We're already on episode 43, and this is only the second Super Nintendo episode in the series, so I'm still gonna go with rather well-known titles here, starting with one of my most played Super Nintendo games of all time, Tetris Attack, or Panel de Pon, as it was released in Japan, which it should have been called elsewhere too, since it has practically nothing to do with Tetris, apart from it being a puzzle game. At least, the non-Japanese marketing people came to their senses and changed the sequel titles to Puzzle League and variants. The way the game proceeds is that you get a seemingly random set of blocks rising from below the screen, which you need to swap around to connect at least 3 in a vertical or horizontal row. The more blocks you can get together, the bigger the score. There are various types of 2-player modes in the game, and the need for getting more than 3 blocks together increases with the amount of garbage your opponent gets thrown as the battle gets more intense. Panel de Pon and Tetris Attack differ slightly, most notably by their set of background graphics and characters you play as and against. Tetris Attack draws its characters from Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island, whereas Panel de Pon has a bunch of fairy girls. Panel de Pon is missing the password system from the VS mode, and Tetris Attack has an options menu which can't be accessed in Panel de Pon without a cheat device. Some of the music has also been switched for Tetris Attack to go with a Yoshi theme. I mentioned that it's one of my most played Super NES games of all time, and there's a peculiar reason for it. Some years ago, I used to play this with my cousin pretty much every time while he was suffering from a flu-related fever, and this was a good way to waste time in that state of mind. Personally, I could never get my head around the game's mechanics quick enough when I had a fever. But anyway, for my money, Tetris Attack is definitely one of the best puzzle games that any Nintendo console has to offer, but also one of those games you really need to play against a human opponent to get the most out of it, possibly in a fever. One of the most famous and longest Nintendo-originated franchises of all time has to be Mega Man, or Rockman if you're from Japan. Mega Man X of the Super NES was the one I played the most, though I've never had the game in my collection. The one you're seeing footage of is a borrowed Japanese card, which is how I originally came to know the game. If you're even the least bit familiar with the series, Mega Man X continues the same form of side-scrolling, platforming and shooting as the NES games prior to this. Only this time there seems to be a clearer plotline included in the game, which is probably the main reason why I enjoyed Mega Man X so much more than any of the NES titles in the series. Also, I think the overall presentation that was light years ahead of the NES games might have biased me in favor of the 16-bit Nintendo, since I didn't really get to try out the original NES Mega Man games until later, and I never felt more than underwhelmed about them. But there's just something about how the game's story rolls out and the weapons and enemies evolve together through the game, which I know is how the original NES games worked out, but it's somehow more satisfying and impressive on the Super NES. The odd thing about Mega Man X is that I've probably played it more on the PC than on the Super NES, because I had that in my PC games collection when I still had my first PC, but the nostalgia is stronger in the Super NES version. And I can't move on without mentioning the film adaptation of Mega Man, which has been in development since 2015, but now that Netflix acquired the film rights in 2020, we might actually see this happen. Perhaps then the other games in the franchise might become more interesting too. If there's any TV show-based game that got me hooked despite me not being much of a fan of the source material, I'd say Biker Mice from Mars would be the first one that would come to mind. I mean, yeah, the whole concept of the animated show is so off the wall that you can't help but love it for its cheesy B-movie factor, but there are 3 important things to get right with that: your age, your sense of humor, and the animated show should under no circumstances be dubbed to Finnish. Of course we got it dubbed here, so I pretty much skipped the show on that basis alone. But the game, Well, boy, I tell you, that was the coolest racing game I had ever seen on the Super NES up to that point. And I had already played Super Mario Kart, F-Zero, Rock'n'Roll Racing, and Stunt Race FX. And come to think of it, Biker Mice must be my all-time favorite racing game on the Super NES. It's just that I have no clear idea why. Well, bikes are a novelty in games, really, that's one for sure. Isometric view worked in Rock'n'Roll Racing, so it works here as well. But Biker Mice felt somehow more fun with all the cartoony gimmicks, and it still has a pretty well-rocking soundtrack, even if the game wasn't really based around that. The weapons, the characters, the variety, the entire feel of the game was just epic, pure Konami quality. And of course there were those Snickers tags all over the game, which I later found out was a European feature, but I definitely had a brief period of Snickers addiction back then. Good times. Now it's San Pellegrino and Salmon, which is much more expensive. But yeah, Biker Mice on the Super NES definitely takes me straight back to 1995-96. Time for another obvious choice, although I don't think Yoshi's Island is actually quite as obvious as the original Super Mario World. As it happens, I played this first, and I played it a lot, definitely much more than I ever played the first Super Mario World. I guess the reason why I spent so much more time with this one is because it had a very different style of gameplay despite it being an obvious Mario game with similar kind of platforming and everything. Already the fact that you play as an endless series of Yoshi creatures primarily, instead of Mario or Luigi, although I can't remember if Luigi even makes an appearance in this one, and Mario himself only appears in an infant form, and spends most of his time riding Yoshi. The puzzle elements and how Yoshi is controlled in Yoshi's Island are much more modern for its age than those in Super Mario World, and the graphics are definitely in a notably different style than any of the earlier Mario games. Somehow this all just appeals to me personally a lot more than any other Mario game ever, before or after. But I'm sure Yoshi's Island is such a recognized game from the Super NES library that I need not dwell further on the game itself. As for my personal experience with the game, my friend SJ, whom I have mentioned often, lent me his Super Nintendo, if I remember correctly, for a week, some 22 years ago, along with a bunch of games, Biker Mice and Yoshi's Island being two of them. And I have to say, there's only one other game in the entire Super NES catalog that I have been as instantly hooked on as this, and that is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which was mentioned in the previous Super NES Nostalgia Trip episode. I have completed this game only twice, but that's still twice more than most games I've ever played, and I'm genuinely afraid to start playing it again, because if I do, I wouldn't be doing much else. Last, and if you consider this the least, I'd hazard a guess it's not the most obvious choice. Super Strike Eagle from Microprose. Yeah, it might come as a bit of a surprise to some that one of the best strategy and simulation game developers from the 80s actually made something for the consoles as well. From the two titles for the Super Nintendo, Civilization being the other one, Super Strike Eagle was the only one I played back in the day, and I did play it a few memorable times. It's not a simulation nor strategy based as you would expect, seeing as it's a Microprose game, but instead it's a very action based shooting and bombing affair from various points of view. Of course, it wouldn't be a Microprose combat flight simulation game if you didn't get to choose and load your weaponry before your chosen mission starts. The action itself happens in three parts: flying around the overhead map, first-person dogfighting in the cockpit, and an odd 3D overhead bombing and shooting segment when you have entered the target's more immediate airspace. To be brutally honest, there's no way you can do a proper simulation on a console where the controller only has 6 different buttons aside from the D-pad. But Super Strike Eagle finds a good middle ground between too much simulation and too much arcade action. It's a good addition to any classic Nintendo fans collection, particularly as it's a Super NES exclusive.